Hello, I am giving a talk at the American Anthropological Association's annual meeting in Seattle on November 10th and wanted to record the talk. I'm giving it live in person, but wanted to record the talk so people that aren't attending actually have access to it. And so my name is Adam Johnson. I'm a doctoral candidate at University of Texas at San Antonio in anthropology, and this is my talk, Making a Multi-Species Community in the Texas Hill Country. In this talk, I'll discuss the long-term relationship between property owners, Roger and Judy, and a group of javelinas in the Texas Hill Country. Work at this site is part of a larger project over the past 3 years studying human javelina relations across Texas. The project involves participant observation with property owners, national park tourists, and the javelinas alongside ethology and interviews. The study aims to understand how humans and javelinas co-construct affective encounters and consider how human-wildlife encounters can result in positive experiences for all parties and create spaces where humans and others can live. Furthermore, I consider the possibility of how long-term assemblages coalesce into diverse multi-species communities. Javelinas, also known as collared peccaries, are pig-like mammals native to the Americas. They range from the American Southwest through Argentina and occupy a great diversity of habitats, from arid deserts and scrublands of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to the tropical forests of the Amazon basin. In Texas, javelinas are mainly found across South and West Texas, with fewer groups in the Texas Hill Country and Panhandle. Since Texas is more than 90% privately owned, most javelina groups are on private land. And this creates many opportunities for humans and javelinas to encounter one another. Javelinas live in small, tight-knit groups and communicate with each other through physical contact, a wide array of vocalizations, postures, and scent. If you spend time around javelinas, you'll observe grumbles, purrs, yawns, their hair standing up, and stomps. One thing that research participants are keen to express is that you will smell javelinas before you see them, earning them the nickname of skunk pig, and they smell kind of like really cheap cannabis, or some research participants said they smell like skunky beer. Smell is caused by oils produced in the scent glands on their lower backs. And javelinas use them to mark their home ranges and one another, and is thought to indicate group membership. Olfaction is a critical sensory modality for javelinas. This is an important consideration because they have poor eyesight. This knowledge is necessary for human javelina encounters as it informs javelina behavior. At the Texas Hill Country Ranch, when the javelinas exit the forest and enter the yard, they periodically pause, lift their heads to smell the air, and take account of the space. The hair along their back raises, called piloerection, which indicates their anxiety. They may also yawn, displaying 4 large canine teeth, which, as Roger explains, is a way to prove they're tough guys. These behaviors are salient for encounters with javelinas, and Roger has learned to interpret javelina behavior and respond meaningfully. The study site is located in the Texas Hill Country, about 90 miles northwest of San Antonio. The Hill Country is on the Edwards Plateau, and it's characterized by hills and large valleys with a diverse array of plants, including live oaks, ash juniper, many shrubs, prickly pear cactus, and persimmon, all of which are relevant to the javelinas for food and cover. As you can see from the map, javelinas are widely dispersed throughout South and West Texas and are less common in the Hill Country. Conversations with residents throughout the area yield very few sightings. The nearest known group to this site is about 5 miles to the southeast. Many residents living in the area report never having seen javelinas, even those that have lived in the area for decades. The map on the left represents the 12 ecoregions of Texas. That's what the colorful areas are. The black circles are javelina sightings as reported on the citizen science app iNaturalist from January 1st of 2015 to April 30th of 2022. And the star is the location of the study site. The property itself is nestled on the side of one of the hills that's emblematic of the Hill Country, about a mile down a dirt road. The yard contains 3 buildings, as you can see in the video on the right-hand side, 2 cabins, and a workshop. And this overlooks the valley. The hill continues up to the north behind where the camera is, rising an additional 80 meters above the yard, where the javelinas primarily bed and spend much of their day. The hill is a mix of live oak and ash juniper trees interspersed with persimmon and prickly pear cacti. In the yard, Rogers installed an automated deer feeder and later a drip pond, as shown in the video on the right. The video shows the buildings and javelinas visiting for a drink. However, the group of javelina makes the trek down the hill several times a day to drink at the drip pond or eat bird seed or corn dispersed by the automated feeder. Sometimes they remain in the yard after they get done eating or drinking, resting in the shade of the cabin or the live oak trees along the property's west edge. Along with the javelinas, the yard sees regular visits from white-tailed deer and many bird species such as scrub jays, cardinals, titmice, and doves. Additionally, the endangered golden-cheeked warbler also nests on the hill directly behind where the camera is. There are also infrequent visitations from foxes, ringtails, coyotes, bobcats, and throughout the day, the yard is a lively multi-species space with birds flitting about and deer and javelina cycling in and out of the yard. With all of these other animals visiting the yard, Roger and Judy manage to live with the animals, often having direct encounters with them. Following work in anthropology and philosophy by Ogden and Gutierrez, Iris Marion Young, and Ava Meyer, I begin with the acceptance of more than human beings as agents in multifaceted political realms. I'm interested in how humans and javelinas practice politics in moments of encounter and how these politics co-construct the space and the subsequent relationality. While much of the work on more than human politics focuses on venues of political discourse and how animals, mostly domestic species, exercise their agency in larger assemblages, I begin with the intersubjective intimacy of encounter. I highlight the sensory and in-place negotiation of contact between humans and javelinas and conceptualize this sort of contact as a multi-species politics, as a callback to the multi-natured, multicultural elements of politics described by Ogden and Gutierrez, while emphasizing the intimacy of encounter between thinking, sensing, feeling beings. As such, I see multi-species politics as an intimate negotiation across difference. While human politics relies largely on linguistic conventions, multi-species politics occurs through body-to-body communication. As Carrie Brandt argues concerning human-horse interactions, communication between species occurs through somatic sensations, physical contact between the horse rider and the horse. The horse and the rider interpret one another through direct contact and oftentimes in the absence of verbal language. Disability studies further elaborate our understandings of non-linguistic communication. Maya Volkin points out that nonverbal people on the autism spectrum find ways to communicate and interact, and interactions occur through implicit bodily relational knowing. This way of knowing extends across communicative and sensory modalities. For multi-species encounters, implicit bodily relational knowing happens through culturally informed and species-specific idioms. While much of the research in human-animal relations and communication occur with companion species or other domestic animals, less has been done on how humans and wild animals communicate and negotiate contact with each other. Roger and Judy, their dog Willie, and the javelinas negotiate encounters and participate in a multi-species politics. They have daily contact, and encounters are nearly always friendly. Whether Roger is photographing birds by the drip pond or working around the property on the tractor, the javelinas will visit the yard several times a day. Roger has learned to understand how the javelinas communicate their anxieties and displeasure and set spatial boundaries through bodily postures and vocalizations to which Roger responds. Likewise, the javelinas have learned to respond to Roger, who tries to communicate with them in comprehensible ways. As an effect, conflict is mostly avoided, and even in cases where there is conflict, the relationship is ameliorated. After developing my understanding of the happenings at the site, the question was raised: what does engaging in this sort of intimate multi-species politics do? It's clear that Roger and the javelinas get along with one another and are not simply living around one another. Instead, they live with one another. Roger reports the relationship as a positive part of his life and makes an effort to have daily contact with the javelinas when they visit the yard. The javelinas also seem to reciprocate this sentiment to some degree, as they will come to the yard even when Roger, Judy, and their dog Willie are present. At times, Roger can even call the javelinas. He also often calls Piggy, 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 and members of the group come trotting, albeit tentatively, out of the forest. During the expulsion of one javelina by the group, aptly named Lindbergh because he was flying solo, Lindbergh would retreat to Roger when being harassed by other group members until he eventually, with two other members, was last seen headed north on the other side of a neighbor's property. The assemblage of beings that make up the property becomes more than the sum of its parts. As Anna Singh points out, assemblage avoids the fixity and boundness that comes along with other concepts and does not assume communal effects. She also asks, what happens when gatherings become happenings? In the case of this site, what happens when encounters are continually successfully negotiated and become intimate, affective relationships? While other terms have been put forward, such as messmates or oddkin, to account for multi-species conviviality, I argue that this assemblage is best thought of as a community, a collection of agents who, through their actions, create a set of expectations that form the basis for informal, in-place guidelines for conduct. Iris Marion Young argues that the notion of the ideal community in social sciences has traditionally overemphasized sameness and neglected to acknowledge the role that difference plays in the making and maintenance of communities. She proposes an alternative, politics of difference, to account for the variability that also characterize social assemblages rather than redefine community. However, I suggest that accepting the impossibility of ideal communities and focus on the real, in-place nature of community is a fruitful way of thinking about diverse assemblages. Despite the differences in bodies, perceptual modalities, and forms of communication, the actors at the site have cultivated degrees of trust. Trust is, at least in part, an effect of knowable expectations when sharing the space. Roger knows how to behave, and the Hovelinas seem to feel safe when visiting. Trust is demonstrated by the fact that, because of Roger's awareness of both Javelina behavior and their individual behavioral patterns, he's comfortable sharing the yards when they descend the hill. Recently, he's even taken up sharing leftover produce from the garden, hand feeding one particular Javelina who calmly approaches when Roger calls them over, as pictured here on the left of the slide. Additionally, as babies are born, the Javelinas bring them down, sometimes hours-old babies still with attached umbilical cords, despite the fact they don't have to bring them into the yard. There's plenty of food up on the hill. They choose to bring them down. And as those babies grow into adults, the trust that the group has with Roger, Judy, and Willie is learned, and each subsequent generation has shown more willingness to engage, and the Javelinas are less likely to dart off and threat display. Despite the general sense of conviviality among the typical actors, such as the people, javelinas, deer, birds at the site, there are others who are not readily accepted into the community. After considering the effects of successful multi-species politics as a community, I wanted to understand how boundaries of the community are maintained and policed. While the majority of actors insinuate themselves into the everyday ebb and flow of the site, feral hogs are actively discouraged from visiting. When they visit the property, Roger typically shoots one, which results in long periods without visits. We can see the hogs moving down in the valley below the cabins, but they rarely enter the property. I suggest that community is defined in part by the participants and their actions, but also by those excluded from participation in the community. During the course of the project, Roger has talked about the feral hogs as not belonging, while javelinas, deer, foxes, and birds do belong. The original conclusion I drew from this discussion of the hogs corresponded with sentiments caused by the native-non-native distinction, this idea that the feral hogs are invasive, they don't belong, and so they're not members of the community. However, recent developments at the property have complicated that conclusion. Over the summer of 2022, two feral goats began to periodically visit the property. They would come down the same hill the javelinas bed on and drink at the drip pond, feed on the corn around the feeder. These goats occupy the same class as feral hogs, a non-native species. Just as the hogs, goats are invasive and in many places cause a great deal of ecological and economic damage in regions where they've been introduced and have escaped captivity and formed breeding populations. This is not the case at Roger's site, but it is a consideration. But despite being non-native, Roger has no problem with the goats visiting. After conducting additional behavioral observations and participant observation at the site, I understand the difference between hogs and goats, not simply as an effect of being invasive, but in the fact that the hogs actively disrupt the community. There are particular ways that things happen on the property which sets expectations. When the hogs visit, they don't meet the expectations of what ought to happen and so create turmoil. I questioned Roger about what makes the goats different from the hogs, and he replied, "The goats don't reproduce like the hogs. And when the hogs come in, they tear up the ground, they dirty the drip pond, they shit all in it. I have to empty and clean the pond. They, talking about the hogs, also eat all the corn and keep the other animals away. He points out the two male goats, despite how hard they can try, will never have a bunch of babies to take over the property. This insight distinguishes this context from the areas that are affected by breeding populations of goats. Additionally, the goats, as pictured on the slide, play the game. They visit the yard and behave like community members when they visit. However, the hogs tear up the property, eat all the corn, they soil the drip pond, they exclude community members from participating in the everyday activities of the site. While these are preliminary conclusions concerning the bounding and policing of multi-species communities, I believe that continuing this investigation will provide fruitful insights into ways that humans and others can form convivial relations and demonstrate the possibilities for living in a precarious world. Thank you.